It started with an envelope, a plain white envelope slipped into my mailbox one summer afternoon, stamped with the official seal of the Homeowners Association. At first glance, it looked like one of those routine notices reminders about upcoming meetings, scheduled maintenance, or the yearly dues. But when I opened it, the tone of the letter sent a jolt of disbelief through me. According to the HOA, my front yard violated community appearance standards. Specifically, the grass was described as ugly, patchy, and non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetics. The letter stated that unless I corrected the issue within 14 days, I would face a fine of $100 per day until the lawn was brought up to their standards. It would have been laughable if it weren't so serious. My yard wasn't a golf course, sure, but it was far from the wasteland they described. A few brown patches here and there from the summer heat, some spots that needed reseeding, but nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I knew where this was coming from. This wasn't about grass. This was about Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was the self-appointed watchdog of the HOA, the kind of person who walked around with a clipboard, peeking over fences, jotting down notes about who left their garbage bins out a few hours too long or whose flowers didn't match the approved palette. Karen lived directly across the street, giving her a front row view of my house. She had complained about my recycling bin, my driveway cracks, and even the color of my mailbox. This grass nonsense was just her latest crusade. At first, I considered ignoring the letter. The fines seemed ridiculous, and I thought maybe they'd back down once they realized I wasn't intimidated. But the HOA wasn't bluffing. Within 2 weeks, another letter arrived, this one not just a warning but an invoice. They had officially charged me $1,400 in fines for failure to comply. I remember standing there with the paper in my hands, equal parts furious and amused. $1,400 for a lawn that looked like half the others on the street. It was outrageous, but it was also a turning point. Up until then, I had tolerated Karen's meddling, shrugged off the nitpicks, and tried to keep the peace. But this was war. I didn't start by fighting back right away. Instead, I began to observe. I watched Karen's daily routines, the way she paced up and down the street with her ever-present clipboard. I noticed how she lingered by my yard, snapping pictures with her phone, and I started taking pictures of my own and not of her, but of every yard in the neighborhood. Yards with brown spots, weeds creeping through, flowers long past bloom. If my grass was ugly, then half the neighborhood was guilty too. I also began reading. Late nights at the computer, I dug through the HOA bylaws and community guidelines. I pored over every vague phrase and contradictory rule. I highlighted loopholes and contradictions. The more I read, the more I realized the rules weren't as ironclad as Karen wanted everyone to believe. In fact, they were full of weak spots just waiting to be exposed. But I knew better than to rush. This kind of battle wasn't won by anger, it was won by patience and precision. So, while the fines continued to pile up, I quietly prepared. I didn't pay them. Instead, I documented every letter, every photograph, every inconsistency. My neighbors began whispering about how I was in trouble with the HOA, but I stayed calm. The real plan was still forming. It came together one weekend while I stood on my porch, staring at the grass that had sparked the whole fiasco. If the HOA claimed it was ugly, fine, I would give them something far more outrageous, something they couldn't have imagined in their wildest nightmares, something perfectly legal, yet designed to turn their own rules against them. That's when the idea of the transformation took root. Not just reseeding the grass and not just planting flowers. I was going to reinvent the entire yard from the ground up, and I would do it by exploiting every loophole buried in the HOA's own rulebook. Rock gardens, native wildflowers, decorative art installations, all technically allowed, all far more eye-catching and disruptive than a simple lawn. By the time I was done, my yard wouldn't just pass inspection. It would dominate it, and best of all, there would be nothing Karen or her clipboard could do about it. As I sketched out the first designs, a sense of calm determination settled over me. The HOA thought they could bully me with fines. Karen thought she could shame me into compliance. They had no idea they were about to unleash a nightmare they wouldn't be able to control. The first shovel of dirt would be the opening shot, and once the work began, there would be no turning back. Because this wasn't just about grass anymore. This was about principle, power, and showing the entire neighborhood that one homeowner could stand up to the HOA and win. The stage was set, the battle lines were drawn, and the ugliest lawn in the neighborhood was about to become the most infamous. The first step in any war is reconnaissance. By the time summer faded into early autumn, I had already assembled a binder thick with HOA rules, highlighted sections, and photographs of neighboring yards that were just as ugly as mine, if not worse. But the binder wasn't my weapon, it was my shield. My real weapon would be my yard itself. The bylaws of the HOA were clear on one point. Lawns were to be maintained in a manner consistent with community standards, but the rules never defined what those standards were. There were lists of prohibited items and no broken-down vehicles, no chain-link fences, no livestock, but nothing that specifically required grass. The only requirement was ground cover, and ground cover, by definition, could mean far more than neatly clipped green blades. So, while Karen strutted up and down the street with her clipboard, I went shopping. Truckloads of gravel, river rock, and mulch began arriving at my driveway. Pallets of paving stones, dozens of native wildflower seeds, all approved by the state's environmental department. I even bought ornamental statues and decorative metal art, each one carefully selected for maximum impact, but still falling under Yard DA copyright core allowed by the HOA's handbook. The day the work began, Karen nearly had a heart attack. From her porch, she watched as contractors ripped out every square foot of my grass, hauling it away in wheelbarrows. The sound of shovels scraping, stones being poured, and earth being turned filled the neighborhood. Children riding their bikes stopped to gawk. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering. Karen, of course, marched straight across the street, camera phone in hand, snapping pictures as if each one were a bullet in her arsenal. I could practically hear her thoughts. Evidence, more fines, more violations. But what she didn't realize was that every load of rock, every planted flower, every piece of DA copyright core was well within the limits of the HOA's rules. By the end of the first week, the front yard no longer resembled a suburban lawn. Instead, it looked like the beginning of an elaborate desert-style landscape. Gravel paths wound through newly dug beds. The framework for a dry riverbed of smooth stones stretched from one side of the yard to the other, and in place of grass, drought-resistant ground cover plants began to take root, green against the rocks in a way that made the remaining patches of traditional lawn in other yards look plain and lifeless. Karen escalated quickly. Letters from the HOA began arriving almost daily now, each one more urgent than the last. Immediate violation, unapproved modification, subject to removal. She even hand-delivered notes, slipping them under my door with her signature scrawled at the bottom. But I didn't budge. For every notice, I had documentation ready, copies of the bylaws, highlighted sections showing that nothing I was doing violated a single written rule. I sent responses through certified mail, making sure there was a paper trail that proved I was following the rules to the letter. And as I filed away each receipt, each notice, each photograph, I couldn't help but smile, because the yard wasn't just a transformation, it was a legal trap. Week by week, the project grew more elaborate. The dry riverbed was finished, winding like a silver ribbon through the front yard. Beds of native wildflowers exploded with color, bees and butterflies flocking to them in numbers the neighborhood had never seen. Sculptures of steel and stone dotted the landscape, abstract shapes that caught the morning light. By the time the second month rolled around, my yard had become a showcase. Neighbors slowed their cars to admire it, and passers-by stopped to take pictures. But Karen saw none of that beauty. To her, it was defiance, a direct challenge to her authority as self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood. She redoubled her efforts, calling emergency HOA meetings, trying to rally the board against me. She passed out flyers claiming my yard was destroying property values and endangering community standards. And yet, the more she pushed, the more obvious her obsession became. Neighbors who once stayed silent began to roll their eyes at her tantrums. A few even came over to compliment me, though always in hushed tones, careful not to be seen by Karen's ever-watchful gaze. The cracks in her power were beginning to show. One afternoon, I came home to find a bright red sign staked into my yard, non-compliant property. It was the HOA's ultimate weapon. meant to shame homeowners into immediate action. But instead of discouraging me, it gave me the final piece of my plan. I left the sign exactly where it was, surrounded by the vibrant wildflowers, framed by the artistic stonework. The bright red notice looked absurd. Neighbors stopped to laugh at the irony. The most carefully designed yard in the neighborhood was branded as non-compliant. The sign didn't shame me, it embarrassed the hoe. And that was when I realized Karen had overplayed her hand. By turning my yard into a spectacle, she had drawn more attention to it than I ever could have on my own. And the more attention it received, the harder it became for the hoe to justify its attacks. The transformation was nearly complete, but this battle was far from over, because Karen wasn't going to give up quietly. She was too stubborn, too consumed by her need for control. She would push harder, escalate further, and in doing so, she would walk straight into the trap I had been building from the start. The first letter had started it, the fines had fueled it, but now, with my yard in full bloom and Karen seething across the street, the real war was about to begin. The transformation of my yard had turned the neighborhood into a stage, and Karen, unwilling to step out of the spotlight, decided it was time for her grand performance. For weeks, she had simmered, pacing up and down her driveway like a general surveying a battlefield. But with the hoe's bright red non-compliant sign becoming a neighborhood punchline, Karen knew she had to escalate. She could no longer rely on petty fines and angry letters. She wanted to crush me completely, to drag me into submission, no matter the cost. Her first move came in the form of a certified letter thicker than any I had received before. Inside was a formal notice of pending legal action. According to the hoe, my yard violated no fewer than 7 separate clauses in the bylaws. Words like eyesore, public nuisance, and hazard were thrown around freely, with threats of fines that now climbed into the tens of thousands. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Not one of the listed clauses actually applied to my yard. They cited improper storage of vehicles when I didn't even park on the lawn. They accused me of neglecting maintenance, despite the obvious care poured into every corner of the landscape. And they claimed my sculptures were unsafe structures, though none stood taller than 3 feet or posed any hazard to anyone. It wasn't a letter of facts, it was a letter of desperation. But Karen wasn't done. Over the next few days, she staged her own personal campaign of intimidation. She stood at the edge of my driveway, pointing and gesturing to passing neighbors, her voice rising with exaggerated horror as she described the damage my yard was supposedly causing. She filed complaints with the city, hoping inspectors would back her up. She even called the local police one afternoon, claiming my yard statues were blocking the sidewalk. When the officers arrived, they barely concealed their amusement. There was no obstruction, no violation, just Karen, fuming with her clipboard as the officers shook their heads and drove away. Yet for all her antics, she did manage to create one very real problem: the hoe board. Up until now, they had largely stayed in the background, letting Karen run wild. But with her constant pushing and threats of lawsuits, the board could no longer ignore the issue. A special meeting was called, a mandatory attendance for all homeowners, with a single item on the agenda being my yard. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors whispering in clusters as Karen strutted to the front like she owned the place. The board sat stiffly at their table, trying to project authority, though the weariness in their eyes betrayed how tired they were of Karen's drama. Karen launched into her speech, waving photographs, thrusting copies of bylaws into the air, her voice cracking with righteous indignation. She painted my yard as a blight on the community, a personal affront to everyone who had worked hard to maintain standards. She spoke of plummeting property values, of children endangered by uneven rocks, of wildflowers attracting pests. But as she ranted, something unexpected happened. The crowd began to shift. Murmurs rippled through the room. Neighbors who had once nodded along to her complaints now exchanged skeptical glances. Some even chuckled under their breath. It wasn't just me who saw through her obsession anymore. Everyone did. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid out the facts calmly and clearly. Copies of the HOA bylaws, with every relevant clause highlighted. Photographs of half a dozen other yards with brown patches, weeds, and unkempt corners that had never been fined, records of certified mail showing my compliance at every step, and most damning of all, proof that every element of my yard, from the gravel paths to the statuessa, was entirely within the rules. By the time I finished, the room was silent, not in shock, but in understanding. The contrast between Karen's shrill accusations and my calm documentation was too stark to ignore. The board didn't rule in my favor that night. They never would, not openly and not with Karen breathing down their necks. But they didn't rule against me either. Instead, they postponed their decision, claiming they needed further review. In truth, they were stalling, caught between Karen's relentless pressure and the obvious fact that I had done nothing wrong. Karen, however, took the lack of an immediate victory as fuel for her fire. She doubled down. She began patrolling the street at dawn and dusk, photographing my yard in different lighting, as if shadows might somehow create a violation. She scoured my trash on collection day, hoping to find something incriminating. She even hired her own landscape expert, a man with a clipboard and a sour expression, to stand in front of my house and scribble notes while she pointed and fumed. But every move she made only tightened the noose around her own neck. Neighbors grew tired of her theatrics. The board grew weary of her endless complaints, and the more she obsessed, the more attention she drew to the one fact she couldn't erase: my yard wasn't a violation, it was a masterpiece. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. If anything, her failures only made her more dangerous. She had tried letters, fines, intimidation, and public shaming, and none of it had worked. That meant her next move would be bigger, riskier, and far more reckless. And as I watched her pace the edge of her driveway late one evening, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp with frustration, I knew exactly what was coming next. Karen was about to take this battle out of the neighborhood and into the courts. The legal war was about to begin. Karen had exhausted nearly every trick in her arsenal. The letters, the fines, the public shaming, they had all fallen flat. But her obsession wouldn't let her quit. She needed victory, not just for herself, but to preserve the image of power she clung to so desperately. So when the HOA board hesitated, wavering under the weight of her accusations, Karen decided to drag the fight out of the neighborhood and into the courts. The summons arrived in a crisp white envelope with the official stamp of the county courthouse. It wasn't a casual threat this time. The HOA, led by Karen's relentless push, was suing me for failure to comply with community standards. They demanded immediate removal of my landscaping, daily fines reinstated, and coverage of the HOA's legal expenses. The total claim exceeded $50,000. For many homeowners, that kind of number would have been enough to force surrender. Most would have given in, torn out their yard, and gone back to a lifeless square of grass just to avoid financial ruin. And that was what Karen counted on: fear, pressure, submission. But what she didn't count on was the fact that I had been preparing for this moment from the very beginning. Every letter, every notice, every photograph, I had saved them all. My binder was no longer just a record, it was a weaponized archive of evidence. And beyond that, I had spent months consulting quietly with attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes, lawyers who had seen Karens like her 100 times before. They assured me of one thing: the HOA didn't have a case. Not even close. The day of the first hearing, the courthouse steps became the new neighborhood stage. Karen arrived early, flanked by two members of the HOA board and her so-called landscape expert. She carried herself with the smug confidence of someone who believed she had already won. The rest of the board looked less certain, their expressions tight with unease, but Karen barely noticed. She was too busy glaring at me as I approached with my attorney, binder in hand. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings began with Karen's testimony. She wasted no time, launching into her usual tirade about ugly grass, decreased property values, and hazards to children. She waved photographs, pointing dramatically at the wildflowers, the sculptures, the gravel paths, as if each were a crime scene. Her expert backed her up with vague statements about non-standard design and aesthetic disharmony. But under cross-examination, their case began to unravel. The bylaws they cited were vague, their definitions inconsistent. When asked directly if any rule required homeowners to maintain grass specifically, The expert faltered. When pressed on whether wildflowers qualified as ground cover, he admitted they did, and when my attorney presented photographs of half a dozen other yards with visible brown patches, weeds, and overgrown shrubs, the courtroom could see the truth. My yard was being singled out. Then it was my turn. My attorney laid out the evidence meticulously, one piece at a time. Certified letters proving I had responded to every notice, photographs showing the transformation of the yard, each step documented with precision, copies of bylaws with highlighted sections proving compliance, even receipts showing that every statue and piece of copyright core was purchased from stores that marketed them as outdoor appropriate. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the pages, occasionally glancing up at Karen, whose face had shifted from smugness to tight-lipped frustration. The more evidence we presented, the clearer it became. The HOA had no grounds for their claims. This wasn't a case about violations, it was a case about harassment. By the end of the hearing, the judge had heard enough. The HOA's motion for immediate removal was denied, the fines were ruled unenforceable, and while the case wasn't dismissed outright, the judge scheduled a full trial for later till it was clear which way the scales were tipping. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking like gunfire against the marble floor. The board members trailed behind, avoiding eye contact, their confidence shaken. For the first time, Karen's power looked fragile. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She would regroup, dig deeper, and push harder. And as the trial date loomed closer, her desperation only grew. She began canvassing the neighborhood again, knocking on doors, trying to rally support. She claimed the judge had misunderstood, that the trial would set things right. She circulated petitions, demanding stricter yard rules, but fewer and fewer neighbors signed. Most were tired of her drama, embarrassed by the spectacle she had created. Behind the scenes, more cracks began to show. Rumors spread that the HOA was bleeding money on legal fees. Dues had quietly been raised, and homeowners were beginning to grumble. Some whispered about Karen's misuse of HOA funds, questioning how much of the lawsuit was really about community standards and how much was just her personal vendetta. The closer we came to trial, the more frantic Karen became. She hired a second expert, filed motions filled with accusations that grew wilder by the week, and even began following me around the neighborhood, snapping pictures as if catching me watering my plants at the wrong time might somehow sway a judge. But all her efforts only built the case against her. Every excessive motion, every frivolous claim, every desperate attempt to rally support, it all painted a picture not of a responsible HOA president, but of an obsessive neighbor abusing her power. And when the day of the full trial finally arrived, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Neighbors filled the benches, eager to see the outcome. Some came to support me, others came just for the spectacle. But all of them knew one thing. This was the climax of a war that had consumed the entire community. Karen sat at the front, eyes blazing, surrounded by files and binders of her own. Across from her, I placed my binder on the table with quiet confidence. This wasn't just about my yard anymore. This was about exposing Karen's abuse of power, about pulling the curtain back on an HOA that had let her run unchecked for too long. The judge entered, the courtroom rose, and the trial began. And as the first witness was called, I realized the end was finally in sight. Karen wanted a legal war. She was about to get one. The trial stretched over several tense days, each one peeling back another layer of Karen's carefully constructed facade. What began as a simple dispute over my ugly grass evolved into a showcase of how far one person could abuse power when handed a clipboard and a title. Karen opened with fury, determined to overwhelm the courtroom with sheer volume and theatrics. She produced binders of photographs, printouts of bylaws, and letters she had written, each one marked with her scrawling handwriting. She raised her voice, gestured wildly, and painted my yard as an affront to the very fabric of the community. To hear her tell it, my wildflowers and stones were nothing short of a catastrophe, bringing shame and ruin to the entire neighborhood. But the longer she spoke, the clearer the cracks became. Under cross-examination, her claims began to unravel. My attorney asked simple questions, and Karen's answers grew defensive, contradictory, even combative. She admitted she had taken hundreds of photographs of my yard, sometimes multiple times per day. She admitted she had walked onto my property without permission to inspect violations. She even admitted, when pressed, that no written rule explicitly required homeowners to maintain grass. Each admission landed like a hammer blow. The more she tried to defend herself, the more obsessive she appeared. The HOA board members fared no better. Called as witnesses, they squirmed under questioning. Some admitted they had voted to pursue the lawsuit only after relentless pressure from Karen. Others confessed they hadn't even read all the bylaws before signing off on her complaints. One board member broke entirely, testifying that he had warned against the lawsuit from the beginning, fearing it would bankrupt the association. That single word, bankrupt, sent a ripple through the courtroom. For the first time, homeowners sitting in the benches leaned forward, whispering to one another. The truth was finally spilling out. This wasn't just Karen's crusade against me. It was a reckless gamble with everyone's money. My attorney didn't stop there. He introduced evidence of the HOA's mounting legal fees, invoices that showed thousands of dollars spent on filings, experts, and consultations, all funded by homeowner dues. He showed how the fines they had tried to levy against me had no legal standing, how the violations were fabricated, and how the bylaws themselves were riddled with contradictions. Piece by piece, the case transformed from an attack on my yard into an indictment of the HOA's leadership. And at the center of it all was Karen, red-faced and trembling with rage as she realized her narrative was slipping away. By the third day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. Neighbors who had once sat silently now glared at Karen with open hostility. Some shook their heads. Others whispered about recall petitions and audits. The board members looked defeated, their unity shattered. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. I described the day I received the first letter. I explained my decision to redesign the yard, citing each step I had taken to ensure compliance. I spoke of the harassment, the endless letters, the signs staked in my yard, and then I produced my binder, my meticulous record of every interaction, every response, every piece of evidence that proved I had followed the rules while Karen had twisted them. The judge flipped through the binder, pausing to read, nodding occasionally. Then he looked back at Karen. For the first time, her confidence cracked. The verdict came swiftly. The HOA's claims were dismissed in full. The fines were ruled invalid. The demand for removal of my landscaping was denied outright. And then, the final blow. The HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees, a sum that dwarfed the fines they had tried to collect. The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others triumphant. Karen sat frozen, her face pale, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table. The board members slumped in their chairs, already calculating how they would explain the financial disaster to their neighbors. But the damage didn't end in the courtroom. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had once tolerated Karen's antics now turned on her with fury. Special meetings were called. Petitions circulated. Within weeks, the board was dissolved, new leadership voted in, and Karen herself was removed from any position of authority. The HOA's finances, once hidden, were dragged into the light. Thousands of dollars wasted on a pointless lawsuit. Dues spent on Karen's personal vendetta. The outrage was fierce, and it didn't stop at her removal. Rumors swirled about audits, possible charges for mismanagement of funds. Karen, once the loudest voice on the block, became a pariah. Neighbors avoided her. Children whispered about her as they rode their bikes past her house. The clipboard she once wielded like a sword disappeared from sight. Her porch, once a command post for her endless patrols, grew quiet. And across the street, my yard thrived. The wildflowers bloomed brighter than ever, the sculptures gleamed in the sun, and the dry riverbed sparkled after every rain. Visitors stopped to admire it. The local garden club even featured it in their seasonal newsletter, calling it a model of sustainable design. The irony was delicious, but as satisfying as victory was, I knew the story wasn't finished. Karen had been dethroned, the HOA dismantled, but the scars of her obsession lingered. The neighborhood would need time to heal, and Karen herself, stripped of power but still burning with resentment, was unlikely to disappear quietly. Her downfall was complete, but her presence still loomed across the street, a constant reminder of the chaos one person could create. And though I had won the battle, the question remained, What would life look like now that the HOA had collapsed? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The courtroom verdict didn't just end a lawsuit, it ended an era. With the HOA dismantled and Karen stripped of her authority, the neighborhood entered a strange, uncertain silence. For years, every decision about paint colors, mailboxes, lawn ornaments, and holiday decorations had been policed, monitored, and enforced with an iron clipboard. Suddenly, that grip was gone. At first, the silence felt uneasy. Neighbors who had lived under constant scrutiny weren't sure how to act without the threat of fines. Some still brought their garbage bins in early, still mowed their lawns twice a week, still whispered about whether they'd be reported. It was as if Karen's shadow lingered, even though her power had vanished. But slowly, the neighborhood began to breathe again. One by one, homeowners started making changes. A couple down the street painted their front door a bright shade of teal, something Karen had once declared not community approved. Another family planted sunflowers along their fence, tall and wild, swaying in the breeze. Decorative lights appeared in trees, birdhouses popped up in gardens, and children's bicycles sat in driveways without fear of a citation. What had once been a sterile row of near-identical houses began to transform into something more alive, different, unique, imperfect, and better for it. My yard became a kind of symbol. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped to chat, to ask about the plants, to admire the sculptures. What Karen had called an eyesore was now seen as the spark that freed the entire community. It wasn't unusual to see someone standing at the edge of my driveway, taking notes or snapping pictures, and not to complain, but to get ideas for their own yards. Meanwhile, Karen's world shrank. The HOA was gone, her title stripped away, her power evaporated. She retreated behind closed curtains, her once busy patrols reduced to furtive glances from her window. Without the authority of the HOA, her complaints carried no weight. Neighbors ignored her flyers, refused her petitions, and left her phone calls unanswered. In time, her house became just another one on the street, no different than the rest. The woman who had once ruled with fear and fines was now invisible, a relic of a system everyone was glad to leave behind. For me, life moved on, but with a deeper sense of appreciation. Every time I stepped outside, I was reminded of the battle that had been fought and won. The dry riverbed glistened after storms, the wildflowers burst into new colors each season, and the sculptures caught the sunlight just right in the evenings. It wasn't just a yard anymore, it was a testament, proof that one person could stand up to an unjust system and change the course of an entire community. There were still echoes of the past. Occasionally, I'd find myself looking across the street, half expecting to see Karen with her clipboard. But instead, I'd see neighbors waving, kids laughing, yards blooming in ways they never had before. The tension was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like freedom. The HOA was finished. The fines, the threats, the endless stream of petty notices, they were all history. In their place stood a neighborhood that was learning, slowly but surely, to govern itself not with rules and punishments, but with respect and individuality. And as for me, I had no regrets. What started as a letter accusing me of ugly grass had become a nightmare for the HOA, a downfall for Karen, and a liberation for everyone else. My yard had gone from a supposed violation to the crown jewel of the block. And every time I saw someone smile as they passed, I knew the fight had been worth it. In the end, Karen had tried to turn my grass into a weapon against me. But it was her obsession, her refusal to back down, that had backfired spectacularly. She had unleashed a storm she couldn't control, and in the process, destroyed the very power she clung to. The neighborhood would never be the same again, and that was the best possible outcome, because sometimes, all it takes is one battle over ugly grass to remind people that freedom, individuality, and a little defiance can turn even the strictest community into a place worth living in.